The voicemail wasn't meant for me. That's the part I keep coming back to, even now. If my husband had remembered to check which number he dialed, none of this would have unraveled the way it did. But he didn't check. And I listened to the whole thing standing in our kitchen in Kitchener, still wearing my coat. Grocery bags cutting into my fingers, completely frozen. His voice on the recording was softer than I'd heard it in months, softer than he'd been with me in a long time. "She doesn't suspect anything," he said. "Just be patient. Once the paperwork goes through, you'll be the only one on the account. I'll handle the rest." I played it again. Then a third time. Then I set my phone face down on the counter very carefully, like if I moved too fast something inside me would shatter and I'd never get the pieces back together. "My name is Tessa Callum. I'm 31 years old. I'm a dental hygienist. I drive a sensible Subaru. I drink too much Tim Hortons, and until that Tuesday evening in February, I genuinely believed I was in a good marriage. Not a perfect one. My husband, we'd been together 6 years, married for 3, had been distant lately. Preoccupied, he said. Work stress, he said. The economy, the interest rates, the renovation we'd been putting off. There was always something. I'd accepted the distance the way you accept winter in Ontario, quietly, hoping it ends. But this wasn't distance. This was something with a different shape entirely. I didn't call him. I didn't text. I went upstairs, hung up my coat, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a very long time. The paperwork, the account, she doesn't suspect anything. I opened our banking app. We had a joint checking account, a joint savings, and a joint TFSA we'd been building together since we got married. Contributions from both our paychecks, compounding slowly, quietly, the way responsible people do things. The kind of account you don't think about much because the whole point is that it's just there, growing. For later. The TFSA balance was $14,200 lower than the last time I'd checked. I set the phone down again. My hands were very still. I noticed that about myself, how still my hands were, when everything else had gone completely wrong. He came home at 7:30. I heard the door, heard him drop his keys in the little dish by the entrance the way he always did, heard him call my name up the stairs. Up here, I said. My voice came out normal. I don't know how. He appeared in the doorway, tall, familiar, looking tired in the way he always looked tired these days. He asked if I'd eaten. I said I wasn't hungry, Zni. He said he'd pick up something. Did I want anything from the Thai place down on King Street? No, I said. I'm fine. He looked at me for a second longer than usual. Something passed across his face. Not guilt, exactly. More like a calibration, a quick internal check. Then he nodded and went back downstairs. I sat there listening to him move around the kitchen, the microwave, the TV turning on, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening in a house where nothing was ordinary anymore. I did not confront him that night. I want to be honest about that. Part of me wanted to walk downstairs and throw his phone across the room and demand to know who she was and what paperwork and what account and what rest he was planning to handle. But I didn't, because some instinct I didn't even know I had told me very clearly. If you show him what you know before you understand all of it, you lose. So I didn't say a word. I waited. Over the next 3 days I learned things about myself I hadn't known before. I learned I was capable of sitting across a dinner table from someone I loved and smiling at the right moments, asking about his day, laughing at a joke, while internally cataloging every detail of his behavior like I was building a legal case. Which, it turned out, I basically was. I learned I was good at waiting. I also learned that the woman my husband was careful around was a version of me he'd apparently spent years cultivating without my realizing it. The version who deferred, who didn't push, who accepted his explanations and moved on. He expected that version of me now, so I gave it to him. Meanwhile, I went through everything I could access. Our mortgage documents. Both our names, no issues there. Our car insurance, our RRSPs, which were individual. Mine was untouched, his I couldn't see. The joint accounts, which I screenshotted in full. The TFSA withdrawal history, which showed 3 transfers over 6 weeks to an account I didn't recognize. totaling just over $22,000. $22,000. I'd worked full days for years to contribute to that account. I'd skipped vacations. I'd said no to the kitchen renovation I actually wanted so we could keep saving. $22,000 moved quietly in the night, and I hadn't noticed until a misdirected voicemail cracked the whole thing open. On the third day, I called my sister. She's older than me by 7 years. Practical in the way that people who've been through things tend to get practical. I met her for coffee at a place near her office in Waterloo, and I told her everything. The voicemail, the transfers, the account I couldn't identify. The way he'd been looking at me since, which wasn't guilty exactly but wasn't right either. She didn't say "oh no" or "are you sure" or any of the things people say when they don't know what to do with bad news. She took a long sip of her coffee and said, "You need a lawyer before you need anything else." She was right. I booked a consultation for the following Monday. The lawyer's office was in downtown Kitchener, above a financial planning firm, which felt grimly appropriate. She was a family law specialist, somewhere in her 40s, with the kind of calm that comes from spending years in rooms where people's lives are being divided up. I sat across from her with my folder of screenshots and told her the situation as clearly as I could. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked a few questions. How long had the transfers been happening? What was the balance of the TFSA when we'd last filed jointly? Whether my name was still listed as a joint account holder on everything? "It is," I said. "For now." She nodded slowly. "That's important." She explained what I already suspected. That money moved from a joint account without consent could constitute financial abuse under Canadian law. That our marital assets would be subject to equalization under Ontario's Family Law Act, regardless of whose name the money had been transferred to. That I had rights, real, enforceable rights, but that I needed to move carefully and document everything before he realized I was moving at all. "Don't close accounts," she said. "Don't transfer everything yourself. Don't confront him yet. Keep gathering." I asked her if this happened often. She looked at me with an expression that was kind, but not surprised. "More often than people think," she said. "Usually by the time someone's sitting in that chair, it's been going on for a while." I drove home with that sitting in my chest. My sister found the woman. I hadn't asked her to. Or rather, I'd mentioned the unknown account number and she'd done what she does when she has a problem, which is research it until it has nowhere left to hide. It took her less than a week. The account was registered to a numbered company, but the company's director was listed in the provincial registry, a name I didn't recognize, a woman who lived in Guelph. I Googled her. Normal thing, normal-looking person. She had a LinkedIn, a Facebook that was semi-public. She worked in commercial real estate. She was 34. There were photos of her and my husband together. Not hidden, exactly. Just not flagged as anything. Because why would they be? A conference in Toronto last fall. A dinner that he'd told me was a work thing. A weekend he'd said he spent in Ottawa visiting an old university friend. I closed my laptop. I made tea. I stood at the kitchen window looking out at our backyard, at the dead February grass and the bird feeder we'd hung together 2 winters ago, and the fence that still needed painting, and I breathed very deliberately until the shaking stopped. Then I opened the laptop again and kept going. There's a thing that happens when you're in the middle of discovering that someone you loved has been building a parallel life alongside yours. It doesn't feel like heartbreak, not at first. It feels colder than that, more clinical, like you've been handed a document that proves something you didn't want to know, and your job now is to process the document, not to cry about it. The crying comes later, at odd hours. In the car, usually, or in the shower, where I could let it happen without leaving evidence. But in the hours I was actually working, and I started thinking of it that way, as work. I was steady. I was precise. I took notes. I dated everything. I printed what I could and kept the folder at my sister's house because I wasn't sure anymore what he had access to in our home. I checked the security settings on our shared cloud storage. 3 weeks earlier, he'd added a new device I didn't recognize. I stopped keeping anything important on our home Wi-Fi. I bought a cheap prepaid notebook at the drugstore and started writing everything down by hand. Dates, amounts, names, anything I heard or saw or found. Old school, maybe. But there's something about paper that felt safer just then. More mine. He started being nicer to me around week 2. I noticed it immediately. The small attentions that had gone missing over the past year, suddenly reappearing. He asked about my patience, something he'd stopped doing months ago. He brought home a bottle of the wine I liked without being asked. One evening, he suggested we watch a movie together, which we hadn't done in longer than I could remember. And he sat close to me on the couch and put his arm around me, and I let him, because the version of me he needed to see would let him. Inside, I was running a constant calculation. He was keeping me comfortable, making sure I wasn't alert. He'd done the math on how much I knew, or thought he had, and concluded I was still in the dark. The tenderness was a management strategy. It was the kindest way to describe it. One night, he said, almost casually, that he'd been thinking about our finances, that he wanted to consolidate some of our accounts, simplify things. Fewer accounts to manage, he said. Less administrative overhead. I said that sounded sensible and asked if he wanted more tea. He looked at me for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, relief maybe, or calculation, or both. Then he smiled and said yes. That would be great, thanks. I went to the kitchen and stood at the kettle and breathed. 2 days later, I called my lawyer. She told me it was time. I had enough documentation. The transfers, the company registration, the overlap in dates between his work trips and her social media posts, the new device on our cloud account. Enough to establish a pattern, enough to make equalization proceedings very uncomfortable for him if he tried to be difficult. One more thing, she said. Is there anything in the house, any documents, anything physical that you might need? I thought about it. His home office, I said slowly. He keeps files in there. I've never been through them. You're a joint owner of the property, she said. You have every legal right to access any room in your home. That night, after he fell asleep, I went. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just moved quietly through his desk drawers, his filing cabinet, the shelf above his printer. Most of it was unremarkable. Old tax returns, car maintenance records, some work files I didn't understand. But in the bottom drawer, under a stack of old bank statements, I found a folder. Inside was a printed email chain. Between him and someone I assumed was a financial advisor. Not the kind you go to together, the kind you go to alone when you're planning something. The chain was 6 months old. They were discussing how to structure the transfer of assets in a way that would be difficult to trace back to marital property. There was a phrase in one of the emails that made my stomach turn. She has no financial background and isn't likely to question it. I stood in the dark of his office, in my socks, holding that piece of paper, and felt something shift in me permanently. I photographed every page on my phone. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it and went to bed. He was still asleep. His breathing was even and slow. I lay beside him and looked at the ceiling and thought about the person I'd been 6 years ago when I met him, and the person I was now, in this bed, in this dark, holding an entire counter-operation in my chest while he slept through it. I didn't feel angry. I felt ready. My lawyer filed the following week. I wasn't home when it happened. My sister had suggested I stay with her, and after what I'd found in his office, I'd agreed. I packed a bag on a Tuesday morning while he was at work. Clothes, documents, my laptop, the journal, my grandmother's ring that I kept in a box in the back of my closet, and I drove to Waterloo, and I didn't go back. He called that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. His message was measured, careful, just this side of concerned. He said he'd come home and I wasn't there, and could I call him back when I got this? His voice was the same voice from the voicemail in February, the one I hadn't been supposed to hear, the voice he used when he was managing something. I didn't call back. My lawyer called him instead. The next few weeks were not simple. I want to be honest about that too, because the version of these stories, where the woman does everything right, and the husband immediately crumbles and justice arrives in a neat package. That's not what happened. What happened was, he hired his own lawyer. He disputed the characterization of the transfers. He claimed the money had gone toward a shared investment he'd been meaning to tell me about. He produced documentation that was carefully structured to make everything look legitimate, and his lawyer was good. And there were weeks where I sat in my sister's spare room at midnight, reading through financial documents I barely understood, wondering if I'd miscalculated, if I'd moved too soon, if the thing I thought I'd built was actually solid enough to hold. It was. But I didn't know that yet for a while. The detail that ultimately mattered most was the email chain. The phrase "she has no financial background and isn't likely to question it" became, in the hands of my lawyer, a fairly explicit statement of intent to deceive a spouse in the management of marital assets. That phrase, combined with the timing of the transfers and the numbered company registered to the woman in Guelph, made his shared investment story very hard to sustain. His lawyer pushed for mediation. My lawyer advised me to accept, with conditions. I did. Mediation happened on a Thursday in March, in an office building near Victoria Park. I'd been to that neighborhood 100 times. It's the kind of area you drive through without thinking, just part of the city. Now I was sitting in a beige conference room while a mediator in her 60s walked us through the terms of what my marriage was becoming. He sat across the table from me. He looked tired. Not the theatrical tiredness he'd been performing for months, but actual tiredness. The kind that comes from holding a story together that doesn't want to stay held. At one point he looked at me directly and said, "I didn't think it would go this far." I kept my eyes on the documents in front of me. "I know," I said. "That was the plan." The mediator moved on. He didn't say anything else. We reached an agreement that afternoon, the full equalization of our joint assets, including the transferred funds, which were clawed back through the numbered company dissolution. The matrimonial home would be listed, and the proceeds split. His RRSP contributions made during the marriage were subject to equalization as well. My lawyer had known exactly what to ask for, and she'd asked for all of it. I signed the paperwork in that beige room, and then I walked outside into the cold March air and stood on the sidewalk for a minute. Victoria Park was just down the street. The ice on the duck pond was starting to break up at the edges. A woman was walking a golden retriever along the path. A kid was running ahead of her, pointing at something in the water. It was a perfectly ordinary afternoon. People ask me sometimes, my colleagues, my friends, my mother, when she worked up the nerve to bring it up, how I held it together, how I didn't fall apart in the months when I was discovering all of it, layer by layer, each thing worse than the one before. Honestly, I don't have a clean answer. Part of it was my sister. She showed up in the way that only people who've known you your whole life can show up. Not with speeches, not with constant check-ins, just with a spare room and a drawer for my things, and the ability to sit in comfortable silence while I figured out what to do next. Part of it was the work itself, having something concrete to do, documents to find, accounts to track, appointments to make, meant there was always a next step, and the next step kept me moving when I couldn't have moved otherwise. And part of it, I think, was something that's harder to articulate. There's a clarity that comes when you understand that someone has fundamentally underestimated you. Not a righteous clarity, not exactly, more like a cold, still precision. A sense of your own edges, a knowledge of exactly what you are capable of. He had spent months, maybe longer, building a version of me in his head that was easy to manage, compliant, financially unaware, too trusting to question the numbers, too dependent to act. That woman doesn't exist. I'm not sure she ever did. I have a different apartment now, a 2-bedroom in a walkable part of Kitchener, near a farmer's market that I go to most Saturdays. It's the first place I've lived as an adult that is entirely mine. Chosen by me, furnished by me, filled with exactly what I want and nothing I don't. There's a shelf where I keep plants that I'm slowly learning to keep alive. There's a kitchen where I cook things I actually like. There's a bedroom where I sleep well, which I didn't do for the last 2 years of my marriage without knowing why. The settlement funded my emergency savings, fully, for the first time in my adult life. The rest went toward the apartment deposit and a new TFSA. Just mine this time. I picked the investments myself. I read the documents. My financial advisor, the kind I went to myself on purpose, who explained everything until I understood it, says I'm in good shape for where I am. I believe her. Some mornings I still think about that Tuesday in February. The grocery bags on the counter. The coat I hadn't taken off yet. The voicemail playing in the quiet kitchen. That soft, careful voice saying she doesn't suspect anything. He wasn't wrong about who I was then. He just didn't account for who I could become when I found out. That miscalculation was his. The rest of it was mine.